Newcomer. He placed the last of the rocks down on top of the others and walked out of the river, onto his small campsite. Already he'd prepared a small fire, now growing on the large twigs he'd placed over top the smaller ones he'd used prior. Barefoot, he walked carefully over top the rocks that covered the ground. They were large, but their edges, some of them, were quite sharp. He had to be careful not to cut himself. His boots and woolen socks sat next to a large rock that he was using for sitting, and so he took a seat there. Now, to wait. The man sighed, scratching his beard, long yet trimmed. His hair was a medium length, wild but still somewhat tidy. If you looked at him, you'd say he had a contained animosity to his appearance, but both civilized yet uncivilized. He was waiting on the fish, which would hopefully swim into his large rock trap. It was a large half-circle of stones, which he'd taken from the ground by the river, stacked high enough to trap any fish that might happen to swim into it. You might think they'd swim out of the trap because half of it was left open, but they seemed to have a hard time doing so. The man knew this, and he took advantage. He didn't wonder how long the fish would take to catch themselves, because he knew that it would be a little while. For some reason, there seemed to be fewer of them as of late. He did wonder about this, as he didn't know why that was. He had a suspicion. Resting next to him against the rock was his rifle, with the barrel pointed up at the sky, which was cloudy, though it didn't look like rain. It was high-powered and semi-automatic with a large clip. He had quite a few clips left. His handgun was strapped to his thigh, loaded with the safety off. He always kept it off. You never knew when you might need to use it, he always told himself, and so far he'd been right. You never knew. The handgun wouldn't kill a bear, but the rifle would, so the man kept it close. Although he'd never been attacked, he knew that he could be, and he wasn't about to be eaten by a goddamn bear. He was a very cautious man. He had to be, really. If he weren't, he'd have died a long time ago, like the rest. With this fact in mind, he knew that he was still yet safer where he was, and he took some comfort in that. Admittedly, out here in the wild, he felt more at home and more secure than most other places. Of course, there were still dangers, as always. He waited a rate, walked into the river to check the trap, and discovered that there were 3 fish trapped inside. That was fortunate. Normally, it took much longer than that to catch anything. He walked back to his pack and pulled out what would look like a net with a broken handle, but it simply had a handle that extended. It wasn't yet extended. Pulling surely, he extended the handle and made his way towards the trap. When he got to it, standing near the center of the trap, he scooped up one of the fish, tossed it onto the shore, then another, tossed it, then the third. He tossed it and somehow missed the shore. It quickly swam away back into the river. "Damn," said the man. "What was that?" Annoyed, the man quickly went to the shore to pick up the other 2 fish. He wasn't even sure why he'd thrown the last one. He was just being cocky, he supposed, and wasn't thinking. Picking up the 2 fish that remained, he sat down at the rock with them, smacked each of them against it, effectively killing each one, and then pulled out a long knife, which he kept strapped to his belt. He quickly and knowledgeably skinned them, and set a thin rock that he found lying nearby on the center of the fire, large enough to hold each fish, and then set the fish on top of it. That would do nicely. Within a few minutes they were cooked through to the man's liking. He took his knife and slid it beneath each of them, slapping them down onto the rock. They were sizable and would make for a good meal. Raising one of the fish up to his lips, he went to take a bite, but before he could, he heard something. Oh no, he all but growled to himself. It had been a gunshot. Quickly put on his boots, strapped on his pack, slung the rifle over his shoulder, sheathed the knife, and grabbed the 2 fish. He began to eat one quickly, making his way into the nearby forest, which stood just a distance away from the river. He thought that it would be safe to eat out in the open like that. How stupid he was, thinking that he was all alone like that. Hell, he could have been shot dead before he even knew it. It'd been a dumb decision, he decided, but in the past now. He wouldn't do it again, and at the least he'd gotten a couple fish. "Hold up," he heard a voice call to his side. At first the man thought the command had been directed towards him. Fortunately, it hadn't been. Quickly the man ran into the brush, kneeled, and waited. In but a moment, a small group of 2 men and 1 woman, surprisingly, walked out onto the stones in front of the river. They were armed, a rifle each. "There's someone nearby," the woman said. "That's why I said hold up," said the shorter of the 2 men. Each were of average size, but they seemed strong. Neither had a beard, which meant that they probably had a camp nearby. The man wondered how large it might be and how he'd missed it, though it was a large forest. But he didn't want to stick around to find out. Or did he? Hesitating, the man waited for the 3 to do something, but they seemed to be curious about the trap he'd set. They were inspecting it, trying to figure it out. Finally, one of them did. "It's a fish trap," said the shorter man. "Look, there's a couple right there." "That's smart," said the taller man. "Yes," said the woman. "Why didn't we think of that? Wonder how many you could catch with this little trick. Wonder how many with a bigger one. We wouldn't have to do a thing either. Just check back later, she said. If you hadn't missed that deer, said the taller man. The woman laughed. We're not starving, you know. Besides, look, fish. The shorter man laughed too. Leave them. They're too much of a pain to grab without a net. Whoever said this trap is probably still nearby. His fire's still going. We should be more careful. Could be her fire, remarked the woman. Right, said the shorter man. Well, whenever she comes back, we don't want to be around. Maybe we do, said the woman. If this gal knows anything else like this little fish trick, she said, pointing towards the trap, then we might actually get some use out of her. Maybe, said the shorter man. Maybe not. Let's go, suggested the taller man. I'm getting antsy. The shorter man nodded. Let's go. The other two followed the shorter man back into the forest the same way which they'd come from. Probably the camp was in that direction. Hurriedly, the man stood from his kneeling position and walked into the forest. He spotted them fairly quickly, and keeping a distance between himself and their group, he followed them back to wherever it was they were going. The man wondered if he should declare himself. They had said that he could be useful to them. He just wondered for how long and how sincere that comment had been. They seemed like a decent group, but it was always hard to tell with people, so the man stayed cautious and followed them back in silence. It was a long time before the group reached their destination, and the location wasn't obvious to the man, as he couldn't see anything from where he was standing when he lost track of them. Stepping cautiously, he went to the right and approached where they had been standing. Still seeing no one, he became suspicious. It was only a second before one of them had a gun on him. It was a shorter man, and he had his rifle pointed at the man's chest. The man smiled as the other two swarmed him. The man put his hands up slowly. Fish? The shorter man smiled. You're the man who made that trap. The man was smiling. He just found it so damn funny that he was holding two cooked fish in his hand as these three were about to murder him in the middle of the damn brush. Yeah, that was me. He decided that in this case, honesty would be the best policy, but he'd been wrong before. Why were you following us? Asked the taller man angrily. The man didn't say anything. Answer him, said the shorter man, smiling. He had a handsome face, the sort of face a person who was used to being in charge with a smirk to match. The man became more serious. I heard you talking. You said you could use a man like me. The shorter man laughed. We don't need anyone. Don't you? Said the man, eyeing him. I suppose we're always on the look, said the woman, lowering her rifle. The shorter man lowered his as well, but kept it pointed at the man from his hip. The taller one wouldn't budge. The man nodded to himself. Well, all right then, he said, looking at the taller man. I don't bother anyone who doesn't bother me, son. The taller man seemed to ease up a little at that. He was a very impressionable-looking and young man. The man had a seeking suspicion that he didn't have a beard, not because he shaved it off at whatever campsite these people had, but because he couldn't yet grow one. The shorter man spoke again. Yeah, lower your weapon, Smith. Smith lowered it, begrudgingly. All right, Lewis, let's just be careful with this guy. It looks tough. He does, Lewis smiled. We could use him. He pointed his rifle at the ground. We'll take your rifle, though, and that handgun. You can keep the knife, he said in a way that was fakely courteous, as if trying to encourage the man, but not really. The man nodded. Thanks. He reached over his shoulder, took off his rifle, and handed it to Smith. Smith was a good 3 or 4 inches taller than him, but he was about an inch taller than Lewis. He eyed the woman, who seemed around average height for a woman. She was blonde and actually quite attractive, but not in the common sense. What's her name? He asked Lewis. Does it matter? Asked Lewis, still grinning. I'm Penelope. The man nodded. But you go by Penny, right? She smiled. Good guess. I've got to say, said the man, slowly taking the handgun from his holster and setting it on the ground by his boot, which Smith quickly picked up. This is one of the more pleasant shakedowns I've ever been a part of. Shakedown, said Lewis. You really are old, aren't you? The man shrugged. What's your name anyway? Asked Penny. Haven't had anyone call me anything for years, he said. Why don't you give me a name? Lewis laughed. Do you really want me to name you? Just a nickname, said the man, assuming you want me to stick around. The two exchanged analyzing glances. How about Finn, said Penny. Finn, said Smith. Why Finn? Fin, like a fish's fin. Finn laughed. So did the others. All right, said Lewis. Come with us. We'll show you around. Smith, stay behind him, just in case. Smith nodded. You got it. Finn followed Lewis and Penny as they walked further through the forest. Finn could feel Smith's eyes on the back of his head and probably on his knife and hands as well. Fortunately, they had nothing to worry about. Finn had no intentions of harming any of them, but despite the somewhat pleasant shakedown, he was worried about what would happen once they took him back to their camp. Were there others? If so, how many, and what would they think of him? Would they accept him? Only one way to find out. Just a bit further, said Lewis back to Finn. You'll like the others. We're actually pretty decent people. People tend to be, said Finn, when they're not starving. That we're not, said Lewis. No need to worry about us, old man. We're friendlies. All right, said Finn, if you say so. How did we catch you anyway, said Penny. You don't seem like the type to get caught like that. Maybe I wanted to be, said the man sighed, growing tired of all the talk. Tired of being alone, said Penny, smiling back at him. Well, I heard you talking about my trap, he explained. You seemed like good people. We are, said Penny. They turned silent for the remainder of the trip, which was fairly short. When they arrived, it was obvious what their destination was. There was a large clearing in the middle of the trees, obviously created by the people living inside of the large encampment, which is the only word that would aptly describe what that fortified fortress was. There were towers surrounded by spiked walls made of sharpened wood and a myriad of other structures behind them, surely. Finn wondered how he'd missed it, as he knew the area extremely well, or so he thought, but again, it was a large forest. As they approached, a guard from the tower signaled to someone down below, who opened a large spiked gate for them. They walked in, the man from the tower keeping a clear eye on the newcomer. The place was like a village, a big one, as there were houses all around, even some crops, and though Finn hadn't seen any, he suspected that many of the crops were planted outside the wall. As big as the encampment was, it wasn't big enough to house a large field of crops without taking up a ridiculous amount of necessary space. The locals eyed Finn as he walked through with Lewis, Penny, and Smith. Stared, really. Finn figured that they must not be used to newcomers like him, especially the way he looked. He might have been mid-40s, lean and strong, with a long, dark beard and hair. Everyone in the town, all of the men, seemed to be clean-shaven, save a few, but Finn definitely stood out amongst them. He wondered how many people were here. Who's this?" said a man approaching them. He was dressed similarly to Lewis, Penny, and Smith, in gray pants, tall boots, a light shirt, and a dark jacket. He was bald and clean-shaven, and it was pretty clear to Finn that this was the man in charge of the place. Finn stood expressionless, waiting for one of the other three to speak. "This is Finn," said Lewis. "What's he doing here?" said the man. "We thought he'd be a good addition to the group." The bald man sized him up. "You let him keep his knife, I see." "We have both of his guns," said Penny, as if the man were being ridiculous. "Right, well, I'm George Smith." He reached out his hand to shake Finn's. Finn took it hesitantly. "You must be this fine boy's father. Could you tell him to stop pointing that thing at me?" "Of course," said George Smith. "Wayne," he nodded at his son. "Put that down, please." Wayne listened to him. "Yes, sir." "You can't have those back just yet," added George Smith to Finn, gesturing towards his guns. "Not until we know that you're all right, but you can stay in one of our new houses." He nodded towards some seemingly unoccupied log cabins. "Just as soon as you hand over that knife." Finn nodded, unsheathing the knife. George Smith winced a little bit. This was not the man Finn expected to be in charge of such a place. He handed the knife to him, and George Smith took it. "Thank you," he said. "Now." All of a sudden there was silence, and then all Finn could hear was a ringing. People everywhere were running, and the guards at the top of each tower were firing as they went down. Finn looked around and noticed that part of the fence was gone and pieces lied there on fire. There had been an explosion. "You!" Finn could barely hear someone say to him. Someone grabbed him by his collar and slammed him into a building. It was Lewis. "Who did you bring here?" Finn shook his head. "Give me a gun."